So hello and welcome to the next session of Great Shouts Marketing and Growth Webinars. I am Ed Davidson, your host. I'm a fractional head of marketing. This series, we're also always talking about growing pains. So how marketing and growth evolves from moving from a startup to a scale-up phase. They're kind of warts and all interviews with marketing leaders and business owners who've been through this process. And today we've got Will Roberts. He's got so much experience, so operating in kind of senior positions, Seatfrog, Vorbis and Perkbox. And he's successfully sold Loyalty Bay as well from kind of early stage startup all the way to that sale. So great to have you on, Will.
Thanks for having me, Ed. Looking forward to it.
Good stuff. So the kind of kickoff question that I always lay out there is, how do you define when a startup is moving to a scale up? What are your kind of thoughts there?
I think, with these things, it obviously massively depends on the business, the vertical you're in. But in broad brushstrokes, for me, I think startup, it's very much finding product market fit. Have you got something? I think going to scale up mode is you found product market fit, you've probably got a repeatable and scalable acquisition model. And I think nowadays you're generating revenue. About 2 years ago, that probably wasn't the case. Now it very much is. And I think the world's changed, and I think it's important to acknowledge that.
Makes sense. And in terms of the KPIs, obviously when you've got kind of that early stage kind of product market fit, the KPI is going to be very different, but the budget's going to be very different. How did you see those kind of KPIs changing for, say, Loyalty Bay, for example, over time?
So I think I'm a big believer in sort of like tracking incentives, and I think misaligned incentives are one of the biggest killers of businesses, jobs, everything. I think they're terrible. So when it comes to KPIs, I don't think there's ever one size fits all, and people obsess about different models, different metrics. I think again at the startup phase, it really comes down to you need to figure out very, very quickly what is working and why. Depending on what you're going after, and frankly, that means, do you have a product that people want? Can you find more people that want that product? Do they stay using that product? Because again, a lot of people acquire them, and then you have a huge, leaky bucket problem downstream. So it's tracking all of these things. So for me, when it came to KPIs, and it changed across the businesses that I either ran or was part of, and some were B2C and some were B2B, and those metrics do change. I think number one is, where can you find a path to distribution? I think that should be the number one goal as a marketer. What is your distribution secret sauce? And across various different companies, and I can go into this, we found something that really worked. And again, this sort of comes back to the going from sort of startup world to scale up world. So to give you some concrete examples, I ran a company called Dropwine. So we were doing daily deals on wine. It was at the time a sort of Groupon. I think it was a fad that everyone was going through. But anyway, ours was wine. And we focused very much on paid acquisition. We got it up and running with Google Ads. It was working quite nicely, but it was never going to really sort of knock it out of the park. The thing that changed the Dropwine's trajectory was partnering with Uswitch. So Uswitch became our distribution channel. So anytime someone did an energy switch with Uswitch, they got a case of wines from Dropwines. Now that's a channel that if you'd asked us to think about from day one, we would never have discovered. So that's one example. Another example, Perkbox, and I don't claim this was before my time, but Perkbox are famous for being sort of one of the first Facebook advertisers in the UK, and they were focused on SMBs. Again, that you wouldn't put those two things together initially, but it was at the time of custom audiences, so you could do lookalikes. And they built a large part of their business off some cupcake ads in Facebook marketing using custom audiences. So again, it's not something that you would have probably sat down at the whiteboard and go, this is the strategy we should adopt and do, and this is how it will evolve. But that really worked. And to this day, those cupcake adverts, I'm told, still sort of resonate. And no one really knows why. And do they have any sort of, tie into what Perkbox did? Absolutely not, but it resonated for whatever reason. I think Seatfrog is another example. So Seatfrog, they basically clear unsold inventory, first-class inventory on trains. So if you're traveling on a train, there are all of these empty first-class seats, they offer away an app where you can bid on those seats to buy those first class tickets at a much reduced price. Users love it. The traction is great, but again, their distribution came from the TOC, so that's the train operating companies. So the train operating companies would actually distribute Seatfrog app to their users because they wanted to help monetize those seats. And so these are all sort of, I guess when you think about them, they become obvious, but at the start, they're not the obvious tactics. So tying this back to KPIs, right? I think KPIs can be really, really dangerous and if they're too rigid. And in the startup phase, you need to understand what it is that you're optimizing for. Absolutely. You need to be able to measure and track these things. But you, as either the founder of the business, running marketing or product on these, need to have some loosely defined guidelines, and you need to be able to zig and zag figuring this all out. So we might get into it later, I don't know, but the types of person you have in the startup stage are very different from the scale up and the growth stages. And that's a necessity, because at the startup phase, you're all trying to figure out what works, because, in 6 months' time, it might not, and your business is gone. So it's absolutely paramount that you can figure it out very, very quickly. Just in case it's not clear, I definitely am a huge fan of tracking and measuring. It's just not being wedded to those goals if they're not fit for purpose. And 99% of the time when you're a startup, they are not fit for purpose on day one. They evolve, they have to.
Do you kind of believe in kind of North Star metric, and that's overarching importance associated with that, and everything else can kind of change underneath, or is that North Star metric also liable to change?
No, I love the concept of a North Star. I think it's really important that teams align behind something. And I think that's critical. So when it doesn't matter what stage you are in this instance, you do need to align the teams behind this and know what you're tracking and going after. It doesn't mean that North Star can't change or can't evolve. But from day one to time immemorial, like, you need to be able to track something and measure against it. So I absolutely believe in North Stars, and I think it's a great way to sort of rally a team or group of people around something and really double down on it and see what's working and why. And that's the critical part, is understanding the why. Because again, we can all sit here and go, okay, my North Star is monthly active users, or name any of these things. And that's great. You might increase those and it might do really well, but is it actually moving, your bottom line? What are the unintended consequences of having that as a North Star? Again, your MAUs may go up, but actually, your retention is absolutely atrocious. So it's a false metric. And I think everything that I'm saying is about making sure you understand the why and the how. And if you have got a false metric, you have to change it. And I think where people really fall short is they're wedded to it, or they don't change, and it's often because the discussion never happens, right? I think you might have the CMO talking to the CEO, and there should be some, back and forth. There should be challenging these KPIs. There should be some involvement. Maybe we do need to change strategy. But often, particularly when you have a very passionate founder and a quite junior marketer, those things can often be misaligned. And if you're in the junior side of that, it's quite hard to turn around and say, this is wrong, and here's why. So again, coming back to the metrics thing, I think it's very important that you track this and understand it so you can be evidence-based. So when you're having those difficult conversations, it's like, look, here's what I see happening. This is why it's happening. This is what I think we should do about it. And this is how these are the consequences of doing these changes. And some of these are unintended that you may not have thought about. Let's revisit the strategy. Let's revisit that metric. Let's revisit the North Star, whatever that may be. So again, just in summation, I think it's massively important to have something that you're aiming for, call that a North Star, and you can go into wider business functionalities. There's huge debates between OKRs, four disciplines of execution, which is something I actually quite like as well. And most of them, if you boil them right down to, it's okay, this is something we're aiming for. What are the outputs? What are the things that we need to measure? How do we keep accountability going? How do we keep focus on these? How do we track them? And how do we measure for unintended consequences? If you're doing those things, you're in a better place than most. But what's that strategy? And what's that saying? It's your plan doesn't stand the test of the battlefield, kind of thing. You've got to actually be out there doing it and figure it out.
Makes sense. Okay, I suppose then, like, moving on to channels then, and maybe kind of the KPIs around channels. Um, I suppose an issue, did you kind of believe you'd mentioned those like key channels for those companies you worked for before? Do you kind of believe that you need to have like a holistic view of all channels and to make them all sing? Or are there particular channels that you think that need to get right at an early stage to get you up to a certain level? And then you have like a more of a marketing mix of channels, and which stage does that happen in startup and scale up?
Yeah, okay. So I think it's very stage dependent of the company. So I think in the early days, again, you need to find your product market fit. You need to be able to test things and iterate really quickly with data. So paid marketing can get you quite far quite quickly. You can pay to acquire users to test your messaging, your 80/20. It's like, put your Google ads up. Is the messaging working? Are the taglines working? Are people coming through? Are they converting on your site? If not, why not? Is it a site problem? Is it a messaging problem? Is it a product problem? And so I think it's a very good way. And again, a lot of your paid channels, you can do that as long as you've got the budget to do that. But I think it's a good way of testing messaging very, very quickly. And nowadays with the likes of AI as well, you can spin up your creative very quickly. You can spin up your messaging very quickly. You can spin up your landing pages very quickly. So you can test very, very fast. So I think it's a great way of getting that going. And I think it's something that you should test. But it shouldn't be a crutch again. And what a lot of the times you'll find that when you're doing paid, that you'll cap out at some point. It's either because you don't have any more budget, it's either because you're reaching your audience and you can't get any more of it and you need to optimize and do other things. So like, SEO, conversion rate optimization, those type of things. Or it's that, that channel it's reached its natural limit and you need to look elsewhere. So I think as a marketer, if we're talking for a marketer, you should always have a holistic lens. But again, there are stages that you go through this, and certain things you can do far quicker than others. For example, if you want to improve your SEO strategy, that's not going to happen quickly. It takes a long time to do it. If you want to do above the line as well, that requires big budgets. So again, it's very dependent on how much cash you have, where you are in sort of your, the stage of your company, where you are in the cycle of your company as well. So if you're going through these phases, some of these things you might have found optimized. I come back to, as a startup, from a marketing side, your number one goal is to figure out what your distribution channel can be to get you off to the races, whether that's to, raise the next round, boost the metrics at your VCs or your, whoever's backing you, or just to drive revenue. It's like getting to profitability, because then you have optionality. And I think that's the key from these things. You need to get to a place where you can test the options, because absolutely you should be trying all of the different channels to see what works, and over time they will change. Some will be saturated, new things come along that you need to test and try and learn on, and absolutely you should do that. Again, coming back to the Perkbox example, it was a non-obvious thing to try, Facebook ads, but you need to try that. Likewise with at Forboss, for example, we started with above the line advertising, and that there was a reason for that, and the reason was we were hyper local and targeted. So we enterprise fiber company focusing on B2B businesses in London, very specific market. London was it, right? And so trying to generate awareness and trying to get our brand out there and who we are above the line worked really well in London. And we had the budgets to be able to do that. But if you're a startup at the early stages, it's very unlikely that you have those type of budgets. And also it would probably be completely the wrong type of thing to do if you're a SaaS software business in London. It just, again, it's picking and choosing the channels and the distribution methods that make the most sense for your business. And then it's going, how quickly can you iterate and test and move on from those to make sure that you have a repeatable, scalable model.
And when do you think the kind of brand plays into this? Obviously, if you get more brand awareness, then potentially other channels are going to sing for you and work better than if you didn't have that. So does the brand, it should be, you obviously got kind of the value proposition and positioning messaging there, but also, brand for developing awareness, it might be a lot more difficult to see those direct returns straight away, which maybe your VCs want. So where does that kind of fit in your stages there?
Again, it sort of depends on the type of product that you're ultimately selling, right? So a lot of the dream world is you have that SaaS app that has product-led growth, right? And we're all like, oh, brilliant, the users just keep paying. It's rare. If you're in the consumer space in a really competitive vertical, like wine is a competitive vertical, brand counts. It matters. You need to get out there. There's trust that you have to build with your users. Same with and the likes of Vorbos with B2B enterprise. No one had ever heard of Vorbos before, but with you're trusting your critical infrastructure with us. You need to be damn sure that we are who we say we are. We do, and we had a super premium quality product at a really competitive price. It's a really, really great product, but sometimes that could sound too good to be true. So you have to prove it. So the brand awareness and the credibility side in that instance was super important. So it really does depend on the product that you have, the audience that you're going after. So I think it should always be part of your arsenal. Brand is important. And I see those things like age-old debates online or people like brand doesn't matter, blah, blah, blah. It absolutely does. Of course it does. But it may matter at different stages, and to the extent it matters may vary across your businesses. And if you are one of those really lucky people or businesses where you do have something like product level, right, or you found that distribution channel where you can put £1 in and get £3 back, brilliant. Obviously you should do that and keep doing that. But it doesn't mean you should ignore the other aspects of your marketing mix, your product mix. And I think one thing I touch on my side is too often I think business units are siloed. So whether you're the marketer, the product person, the salesperson, you have to talk because you're all getting information from users, from people you sell to, that should be fed back into your marketing mix, your product mix, your sales mix. So, wearing another hat as a chief revenue officer, okay, and one of the key things was making sure there was alignment across all of the different go-to-market functions. Because again, it's really, really important. And you pick up nuggets of information that are so useful for the other parts of that business. And unless you're sharing and transferring that knowledge, unless you're working together as a team to deliver on those results, it's really, really difficult. So again, I've seen it time and time again where the head of marketing is competing directly against the head of sales. Well, and it's like, why? This comes back to my misaligned incentives point. I think if that's happening, it's usually because of management setting the wrong incentives, because you really want those two people, those two teams, really tight knit, working as a unit together, because they can help one another. And ultimately, both of them are helping drive the revenue function, which is what you need for your business, because you need happy paying customers that keep doing that, and you need to get to profitability.
In terms of the funnel there, I think the kind of classic view of it is, well, you've got one section of or department that creates and does their job, and then it's passed on to the next, and there is a kind of silo there. And I think it's a perfect kind of funnel of progression, but the customers don't act like that. They're not engaged in that way, and so having all the departments talking together and having feedback loops and sharing information, is massively important and powerful. I was wondering as well, were there any kind of acquisitions as part of the growth strategy where you acquired other businesses and absorbed them?
So I mean, personally, I haven't acquired another business, but obviously my business was acquired by Paradox. So it definitely happens. It's definitely a really interesting path, and I think it certainly makes sense to look at depending on the stage of your business, right? So it really comes back to what is it that you're optimizing for and why, and would a strategic acquisition make sense? It might be because you acquire a user base. It might be because it adds functionality to your product. It might be because they're a competitor and they're stealing your lunch and you'd rather have them inside than outside competing against one another. So again, there are all of these extremely valid reasons for why you do it, but it ultimately comes down to the business case. It's like, okay, if I spend this money here in acquiring this business, is that going to give me a greater return than if I try and do this myself? Does it speed things up? Do I have the capital to do it? How am I going to pay for the capital? Am I raising investment? Am I funding it out of cash flow? Am I doing it another way by debt? And again, that comes back to the macroeconomic factors, like what's happening in the world at the moment. We lived to 10 years in the zero interest rate environment. money was cheap. That's certainly not the case now. Money's much more expensive. And so you have to weigh that up in terms of your overall strategy about how you're going to grow. It's certainly something that you should look at, not when you're a startup, but when you're slightly bigger, it certainly makes sense to. I think as a startup, it totally makes sense to look at who might be an acquirer of you. At Loyalty, that we did that from day one. Because you never know, right? Like when you're a startup and if you're VC backed, the dream is to, get that $1 billion valuation and IPO. But let's be honest, 99% of those businesses don't go that way. So you need to have some backups, and you need to look at who might be relevant to you. And sometimes, and we had to do this, we had to position ourselves so that we were attractive to our acquirer, because we weren't going to be one of those unicorns. We knew that. But how do you get the soft landing, the good landing, whatever you want to call it? You do need to position yourselves, and you need to figure out why. And your job as a CEO or founder of that business is certainly to think about that, because you've got to safeguard your shareholders' money. Or if it's your own money, you need to safeguard yours, right? And so again, all of these things, I come back to, there's never one size fits all. And as a founder or a CEO, you need to be thinking about all of these things. And then you leverage your experts within the business. That might be your CMO, your head of marketing, whatever it is, or the different roles. And that's why it comes back to the team side. And that's why it comes back to the incentives and making sure you're all aligned thinking like this. Because again, the strategic piece often gets palmed off, or, and I think it's crazy. Often the people closest to the problem are the best at helping solve that problem. As an example, it might be a junior marketer has got something that's really, really, just use that as an analogy because we're talking marketing here. They might have some insight that's really, really valuable. They shouldn't be dismissed. So you need to make sure that that feedback loop is getting into you, and you need to make sure that it funnels up and down so that you can react to it. Again, that cupcake idea at Packbox, I think it might have come from one of the founders, but it might not have. I don't know. And the point is, like, if they never found it, I think they'd be on a very different trajectory. So you need to make sure you're uncovering these things, and no one's too big to look at these things. So
makes sense. Let's talk about team then. So in terms of, again, moving from a scale up to a startup, how do you kind of structure the team, the kind of generalists or specialists? How does it work in terms of team hierarchy or roles? Good to kind of understand how you've kind of seen it from different angles.
Yeah. Okay. So I think if I'm going to generalize, because again, I'll come back to sort of the types of business, B2B, B2C, you have different team structures and things like that. So, but at its most basic, from a startup side of things, you need doers. You need people that can roll up their sleeves and figure stuff out. They like to solve problems. They learn. They have the growth mindset. A lot of these are cliche terms that you hear, but it's true, right? You want that smart, capable person that will try and figure things out, as opposed to that seasoned veteran who's, had a huge budget at their disposal and been inside of a large corporate where things worked really, really well. I'm not dismissing them. They're just the wrong people, right? And so at the early stages, I think it's paramount that you have people that try and solve problems. And they solve problems collaboratively, and they figure things out, because ultimately that is the name of the game. You're trying to survive from one day to the next. And in order to do that, you need to figure out all of the things that we've just been discussing. What's your product? Who your audience is? How do you make it repeatable? How do you make it scalable? And so those people need to be smart. And more than smart, actually, it's curiosity. They're going to try lots of different things, but they try it in a way that's scalable. So that is measuring, testing, writing stuff down, so that you can repeat it and do it, and so that you can onboard others very quickly. So I think that's another key thing. It's like when you're going through the startup phase, the scale up phase, when you get into scale up mode, one of the biggest time sinks is onboarding. When you're hiring, you have to recruit these people, you have to onboard them, you have to teach them about, the culture, you have to teach them how you've done things, you have to teach them about documentation, your product, blah, blah. The list goes on. I mean, if you're hiring a team, so we went from, at Vorbus, it was 19 people to 450 over the course of, I think it's like 18 months. Maybe a bit longer, but that takes a huge amount of time of no matter what position you are in the company to onboard those people and do it. So coming back to when you're at a startup, it's figure stuff out and do it very, very quickly. As you start to progress, you're starting to find product market fit. You start to bring in specialists. So you found it, let's focus on the marketing side. On the marketing side, you found a distribution channel that's working. Okay, it probably makes sense to hire someone in to run that, whatever that may be. But it doesn't mean you don't stop looking for others. So you still need to have both the double down on the thing that's working, plus keep iterating and testing, because that thing may not continue to work some way down the line, and you need to have not all of your eggs in one basket. So as you scale this up and you bring in it, and then as you get bigger and bigger, then you start to have, you know, different things that you're optimizing for. Your team might be large, you might need management in there, you might need some more structure in there, you might need some seasoned people who have been there and done that. It might be trying to open doors. There's a whole host of things or skill sets that you might need, but again, it depends on the problems that you're trying to solve. I think one thing that you should never do in your early stage is bring in those like so-called seasoned experts who are on a huge salary on day one, not as a full-time, because they'll fail and you'll fail. You know, they'll be really annoyed because they're brought in because they're expecting to do X, Y, and Z and they can't do it. You'll be really annoyed because you just hired this brand named person from this thing and it hasn't worked out and you spent a lot of money in doing it. So again, it's not to say that those people aren't good. They are great, but they're great at the right stage. And so in terms of the team makeup, I mean, we can get into specifics of in terms of functions. I don't know how you want to take this because startups quite all encompassing. It's like there's lots of different roles. So
I think it's really fascinating, especially what you're saying about onboarding. Also, it's when you're bringing kind of management structure, when you do that, but try and keep it as flat as possible. As you're saying, when you've got a junior person who's still coming up with the ideas. I think it'd be interesting to know when you were bringing in in-house people versus agency. So where you were using kind of agency or fractional people and a kind of core group of in-house as well.
So I think agencies can be really good and they definitely have their place in the mix. But again, agencies are often expensive. So they're a luxury. Like as a startup, it's very unlikely that you can have budgets for a big agency. You might have the budget to hire people on a part-time basis. It might be someone, you know, optimizing your paid search as an example. And so again, it's looking at your mix and what you're trying to achieve. So again, agencies, like it's a broad brush stroke term. So it's really, what are you trying to solve for? Can you hire the people? I think ultimately, no matter where you are in the business, you probably eventually want those people sitting within your org rather than outside. But agencies are quite a good way of, if you have the budget to be able to do that, to figure out a problem to see whether it's worth hiring that in-house. They help leverage their expertise, the stuff that they've worked across, to see whether this is a channel or a type of person that would work for you and your business. And if that is the case, then there's this natural offboarding where you spin it up with the agency, and then over time you bring that knowledge in-house, and it's a speed thing as well. So at Forbes, for example, we did use agencies and they were great, loved working with them. And they had a load of expertise and they allowed us to move very, very fast because we were hiring lots of people. Like if we had to hire all of these roles all at the same time, all with that expertise, whilst trying to manage it, grow the product, grow the team, and all of these things, it just becomes really, really challenging. So it's quite nice to know that you have a safe pair of hands that's been there and done this before, that has expertise and credibility in what they do. Because again, when you're talking at sort of like VC, like large round level or private equity level, there's big budgets involved in this. You can't mess it up, right? So there's having some of that expertise and knowledge that you trust these people to be able to execute and do their jobs. But I think one of the starting premises when you do engage that agency should be like, you know, this isn't going to last forever. Work together with them to work out that offboarding route, because it's in both of your interests. It's in the company that's hiring's interest because you want to bring this knowledge in-house, but it's also in the agency's interest eventually because they want to be successful. They want to deliver and they want to find new clients and they want you to recommend those clients. So it makes sense to do this, but most people I find never have that chat up front for whatever reason. And I think you should, because in its true sense of the word, and everyone advertises that it's a partnership, like often it's not, right? But it should be. And a sign of good partnership is there's probably an end at some point. that you have discussed and you understand why, and there are outcomes. Coming back to where we started the conversation, there's key goals that you've achieved together or done, and it's measurable. It's like, okay, we have done X, that worked, brilliant, thank you very much. And there might be other problems that they uncover. So I'm not one of those people that thinks agencies are good or bad, and I think you need to find good people to solve the problems that you have in front of you. Sometimes that makes sense to go outside, but ultimately you probably want to bring that knowledge in. It's just how quickly can you do that? What are the resources that you have at hand? What is the expertise? And again, hiring takes a long time. To hire, one of your C-suite could take you a year or longer. And oftentimes it doesn't work out, right? So, you need to have your backup plan.
Any tips or tricks for recruitment of the best people? Where are you hunting when you were scaling that crazy 19 to 400 people at Volbos?
It really, again, it sort of depends on where the bottlenecks are. So at Volbos, a lot of it was around hiring in-store technicians. So they were actually, they were building our network. Absolutely amazing people putting fiber in the ground. And that's a skill set that's not very common. We ended up having to build training academies. We built schools. Like Tim, the CEO, one of the things you talk about is a large part of his job is how do you build schools? And I started talking a lot of like that on my side, building the commercial function, because it's actually we're building schools because we were hyper focused. We knew exactly our audience that we're going after. Our product was, in a really competitive market. So we needed to be able to differentiate ourselves. And a lot of that was on the training and the skills that our people had. So for that instance, we were building in-house. We built schools, did that, got certification. In other roles, though, it depends on what type of role you're going at. So you have your network that you leverage, and I think that's always good. One thing I'd have a tip for sort of junior people is make sure they proactively curate their network. I think it's one of those things that when you're young, it sort of happens, and maybe you're not very strategic about it. I think you should be really strategic about it. You should look at these people, where they're going to go, what they're going to do, think about where you want to go, think about the relationships that you want to build, because it might be you might want to learn from them, you might want to get hired by them, ultimately you might want to hire them, or people that they know or trained. And I think from day one, you should do that. And coming back to the startup side, I think one of the jobs of the CEO is your number one recruiter. You should be thinking about what are the gaps you have in your team, who are the people you need to bring on, what are the different stages, because again, not everybody lasts all the way through, and that's fine, right? And actually it's part of the model. I used to tell my team the average tenure is like 2 years before sort of like people burn out and these hyper growth startups. There's a reason for that. Now you can judge the pros and cons and how nice that is, but it's just true. People burn. It's hyper competitive. It doesn't, and a lot of people can't scale or actually don't want to. They love a certain part of the growth cycle or the growth journey, and that's the bit that they want to do, and that's absolutely fine. It should be applauded, and you just need to know when to hop on and hop off. And again, in terms of recruitment, you need to find your avenues. So I think the other bit, we talked about distribution from a marketing side, but you need it from a hiring perspective. You need to be able to work with, and that's where good recruiters can be extremely valuable. Mine your network. Some of the organizations that you may or may not be a part of can be hugely useful. Some of the stuff that you put out yourself or as a business is great at hiring. So again, from day one, maybe not day one, but certainly as you're starting to grow in terms of the scale-up phase, you should have an active strategy around your hiring and how you're going to recruit. And that can fit into the marketing mix as well. And it should, and there are plenty of examples where people have done a fantastic job with this.
Makes sense. Well, it's been amazing talking to you, and we're way over time in terms of the half an hour slot that I allocated. So there's so much content and so valuable. So thanks so much for your time. The last, I suppose, question I normally ask is like the best piece of advice you'd recommend to the founders of a company that are going from that growing pain stage from startup to scale up. Is there kind of one thing that the highest recommendation that you'd have?
If it's specifically for a founder, I think it would be this: know the game you're playing, right? And specifically what I mean by that is you have lots of options. Well, you might not have lots of options as a founder, but like if you're looking to raise money, understand that the game you're playing. right? If you're raising money, you're no longer your own boss. You have shareholders, you have a responsibility, you have demands that are expected of you. That changes the game. It's not good or bad. It just changes the thing. You need to know the game you're playing. As a founder, you're all in, right? You don't have optionality. So you need to make sure you're picking the best partners or picking the best strategy to do it. And sometimes you might have choice. You might be able to pick and choose from your investors. You might be profitable. I think one of the key things you should try and do is get yourself in the best bargaining position possible. And then understand what it is that you're giving up and why. And again, it's not a good or bad thing. It's just understanding why you're doing these things. Because I think most people, in my experience, don't really know what it is that they're giving up or what they're doing, or what they're optimizing for. Again, as a founder, if all your eggs are in basket, that's everything. You probably put, house on the line, everything on the line. You have to be sure that that's what you want to do. And if you're going that route, you need to be damn sure that you're looking at all of the different things that you need to look at. We talked about North Star and all the other things, hiring the best people to make sure that you have the best chance of success. So maybe it's try, but the biggest thing is understand the game that you're playing, because I think most people don't really get it. And that's true of all things. It's not just founders. It's across the world. And understand how incentives work. And again, where I started this conversation earlier, misaligned incentives are the biggest killer of so many things. And frankly, it's unnecessary a lot of the time, but it just needs to be spoken about. So that's what I'd leave you with.
Great. Thanks so much. Well, appreciate it.
All right.
Okay.
Nice
All
to talk
right.
to you, Ed.
Speak to you again. Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.